What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Pioneer video. And we are back with the Beginner's Guide series. And today we're going to be taking a look at the Mono Green Devotion / Nykthos ramp deck for the Pioneer format. It's sort of kind of a newcomer back to the format. If you know kind of the history of this Mono Green Devotion deck, it was very popular with Karn the Great Creator because you got this like wishboard package that essentially allowed you to, if you had enough devotion, generate infinite mana, be able to activate your planeswalkers as many times as you wanted to, and just in general do some pretty busted things. While I wouldn't say, maybe at points it was like one of the best decks in the format, but it was definitely worth being the most played because it had an insane amount of power, because it was kind of this dual threat of putting enough big things into play to where you could just beat down your opponent, or if you just had these permanents stick on the battlefield and your opponent really didn't interact with you in a meaningful way, then you were able to kind of combo them out and exile every card in their library and then force them to draw from an empty library. It was very like cumbersome to play it online in that way. You were better off just, putting all your creatures into play, or just putting a ton of big creatures into play and getting rid of, the key cards from your opponent's deck. So then they were essentially left with nothing, and then going and attacking your opponent for lethal that way. But the Nykthos ramp deck is back, and could be argued that it is a little bit better now, just because it's a little bit more streamlined into one of those lanes instead of being in two. But, we'll explain it, and we'll kind of go over it and kind of explain some of the differences from the older versions and going into these newer versions and stuff like that. And of course, get you prepared to either play the deck or be playing against this deck. So before we get too deep into the deck itself, when we talk about Mono Green and go over all that fun stuff, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me where we tackle the Modern and Pioneer format, along with some other longer form videos kind of pertaining to Modern and Pioneer, some other fun stuff too. We like to have fun on this channel. Be sure to subscribe, ring notification bell so you know when those videos get posted in the future. And it's also a free, easy way to support me and my content as we cruise to 1,000 subscribers. Y'all are absolutely crushing it. I do greatly appreciate all the support, whether you've been here for a while or if you just recently subscribed. I am very appreciative all the same. So this Nykthos ramp deck, Mono Green Devotion, for the people that may not know what exactly is going on, or maybe started playing Magic recently, whatever the case may be, you're essentially trying to abuse the card Nykthos Shrine to Nyx. So this land is a legendary land printed back in, I believe, it was like 2013 in the original Theros block. So it taps to add a colorless mana, and you can pay 2 mana and tap it. You choose a color, and you add to your mana pool an amount of mana that is of that color that is equal to your devotion of that color. So essentially what it's saying is, when you look at your battlefield and you look at how many green pips you have in these cards, like Elvish Mystic here in the top right corner has 1 green mana symbol, that counts as 1 devotion. So Nykthos is saying, like, however many of those green mana symbols you have on the battlefield, that's how much mana this card is going to produce, or of that color if you choose to play something other than green. So with that being said, to kind of abuse this card, you're looking to play things that have a lot of a mana symbol, in this case green, and of course, have them kind of synergize well together, and make as much mana as you can with Nykthos, and then use that mana to play big things, whether it's going to be big creatures or other spells to kind of press some advantage and whatnot. So really important here, you have cards like Leyline of the Guildpact that technically give you 4 green mana symbols, and it's going to be something that you can put onto the battlefield at the beginning of the game if it's in your hand. Your permanents being all colors and your lands being every basic land type really doesn't matter unless you're somehow able to steal some of your opponent's creatures, maybe activate abilities and whatnot. That's not really going to come up. Leyline of the Guildpact is here 99.9% of the time to be a card that is going to give you 4 green mana symbols to your devotion. Elvish Mystic and Llanowar Elves give you a turn 1 play, but they also, in a way, add 2 mana by having that green mana symbol, to give you devotion, plus being able to tap for a green mana themselves. So technically they only add 1, but the green mana symbol in the top does make it a lot more attractive of an option to play on turn 1. Most of these decks would probably just play this anyway, even if Nykthos wasn't a thing, just because of, all the 3 mana spells that are very powerful, and the fact that green does have a lot of those powerful 3 mana spells that do put pressure on your opponent. Where one of the best ones being Old Growth Troll, Outcast Trailblazer is the other 3-drop, and these are both very powerful. But Old Growth Troll is a 3-mana 4/4 trample that's already above rate. It's a creature that's going to hit over all the small creatures and whatnot. But if it dies, if it was a creature, you return it to the battlefield as an aura enchantment with Enchant Forest you control. And the Enchanted Forest taps to add 2 green, and then you can pay 1 and sacrifice the land, or pay 1, tap the land, sacrifice this land, and then create a tapped 4/4 green troll warrior creature token with trample. So essentially, you can sacrifice the land to get essentially the body of Old Growth Troll back. With how this ends up working, Old Growth Troll still gives you the 3 green devotion when it dies and goes onto a land, and then it also has the land tapped for 2 green. So this is like a way that you can play like an Old Growth Troll in turn 2 if your opponent kills it, which is just worse for them unless they're able to also get rid of the land and with that as well, or you don't have a land to actually enchant with this, because they're gonna make that land already tap for more mana, and then you're already gonna have the green devotion. So at that point, you essentially have 4 green devotion. You're gonna have a ton of mana at your disposal on that turn that you're gonna be able to just play a bunch of things and increase your devotion even further for when you activate Nykthos, and you're just gonna add a lot more mana. So Old Growth Troll is just a very annoying card to deal with because it's going to sit on the battlefield. Your opponent doesn't kill it, you still get 3 green devotion. If they do kill it and you have a forest to enchant, it's going to make the forest tap for more mana, and it's going to still give you the same amount of devotion. Which, funny enough, the troll might be more valuable to you dead than the actual 4/4 trampling body. But if it does come up, you can get that 4/4 body back and continue to apply pressure to your opponent if that's kind of where where your game plan is kind of sitting. Outcast Trailblazer is a new card from the Outlaws of Thunder Junction set, which I don't think we can consider Outlaws of Thunder Junction necessarily new, since Bloomburrow is essentially on the horizon here, and of course we had Modern Horizons 3 release as well. But nonetheless, this has been a very, very powerful addition to the deck. As a 3-mana 4/2 isn't necessarily exciting, but it does have plot for the same cost, and it'll kind of be important here, as I kind of explain the card. So when it enters the battlefield, you add 1 mana of any color. Whenever another creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you draw a card. So with this plot mechanic, or this plot ability on this card, you can play an Elvish Mystic or a Llanowar Elf on turn 1, and then on turn 2, you can plot Outcast Trailblazer, for, essentially the 3 mana that you're going to have. And then on turn 3, you're able to play your 3rd land, and your elf lives. It seems like kind of a lot, but, just hear me out here. You can play the Trailblazer from being plotted. You're going to be able to add a mana of any color to your mana pool, more than likely going to be green. And between the 3 lands you have, the mana that you get from the Outcaster, and the mana that you get from the Elvish Mystic, it perfectly curves into Cavalier Thorns on turn 3, which you're going to be able to ramp, hopefully, very likely to end up finding a land. Putting onto the battlefield doesn't come into play tapped, it does come into play untapped. Then you put the rest of the cards in your graveyard, and then when it dies, you can exile it. And if you do, you put a target card from your graveyard on top of your library, essentially guarantee what you're going to draw for the next turn if Cavalier of Thorns dies. The fact that between these 2 cards, you're going to be able to draw a card, you're going to be able to ramp and whatnot. So the Cavalier is essentially going to replace itself, on top of potentially getting you an even better spell. And then the milling works with a particular 4 of in this deck that is going to then even get you more value and help you snowball kind of those Nykthos turns. Cavalier also kind of in the late game as well allows you to keep comboing, which we'll talk about here in a minute. The last creature we're going to talk about is Ulvenwald Oddity. It's a 4-mana 4/4 with Trample Haste and 7 mana to transform Ulvenwald Oddity. So just on its front, it's going to trigger the Outcaster Trailblazer. It's also going to technically trigger Kiora, which we'll get to here in a minute and kind of explain a little bit more of that. But a 4-mana 4/4 Trample Haste is fine for decks that are trying to be just aggressive straight up. But the transform is kind of what puts it over the edge, because you can transform it for 7 mana, and it's going to be an 8/8 Trample Haste on the backside that gives your other creatures +1/+1, and then they have Trample and Haste. So this is essentially the card that we're looking for to kind of cap off our combo, if you will, of just having like a ton of devotion and finding ways to put multiple Nykthoses into play and generating a ton of mana that way, thanks to, again, having a ton of green devotion plus Kiora as well kind of helps out the game plan. So with that said, moving on, Kiora Behemoth Beckoner is a 3-mana planeswalker that has 7 loyalty. That says essentially has the same static ability as Outcast Trailblazer. Whenever another creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you get to draw a card, and -1 you get to untap target permanent. This is a way that you can get multiple Nykthos activations a turn, which if you have a Kiora plus either one or multiple Outcast or Trailblazers, or even just multiple Outcast or Trailblazers, you're going to end up drawing a ton of cards, which means that if you're able to untap your Nykthos and you have like 8 devotion, but then you get to play, 6 more devotion worth of things, and then you get to untap the Nykthos, you can tap it again. You have 14 mana, and you're just going to be able to keep playing even bigger and bigger things, and it kind of pairs well with like Ulvenwald Oddity, because again, if you find like another way to play another Nykthos, you can generate even more mana, and then you can flip the Ulvenwald Oddity, meaning that then all the creatures you just played are not only going to get bigger, but they're going to have trample, they're going to have haste, and they're going to be able to attack in, and more than likely win the game after you've put 30 to 40 power into play as well. But Kiora definitely helps facilitate things by drawing you cards whenever you actually play your big creatures and they successfully enter the battlefield, but then also allow you to double up on Nykthos activations, which again, having all that mana, getting to play all the things, is a way that you can kind of snowball all that action. Moving on, you have these cards that kind of help you find action. So you have Invasion of Ixalan, and you have 2 Oath of Nissa as well. Invasion of Ixalan is like the new battle card type from the March of Machines set. So when it enters, you give it to an opponent, whatever, you're only going to have 1. It has 4 counters on it, so you have to deal 4 damage to flip it. The backside of it, whenever you cast a spell, Belligerent gets indestructible until the turn. Kind of whatever on that side. The front side is when Invasion of Ixalan enters the battlefield, you look at the top 5 cards of your library, you reveal a permanent card from among them, put it to your hand, the rest of the bottom library in a random order. This is going to help you find every card in your deck except for Storm the Festival, which we'll get to here in a minute. Essentially, it's going to let you dig pretty deep. 5 cards is a lot for 2 mana. Get a permanent card, you're going to be looking for Nykthos primarily, and if you already have a Nykthos, then you're going to be looking for, more than likely one of these creatures to just kind of have something big to play and start generating some value, whether it's Trailblazer, because you have some other big creatures that you can kind of pair with this, or, you could pair with another Trailblazer, and then, that's also going to kind of get out of hand once you kind of start getting that card advantage going. You could be looking for Leyline of the Guildpact as just another way to add tons of devotion to the battlefield and whatnot. Invasion of Ixalan kind of does it all. And again, you're not really worried about flipping this thing and getting the 4/3 Trampler on the other side. It's just going to sit on the battlefield, be a green devotion pip, for your future Nykthos activations, and it's going to help you potentially find Nykthos digging 5 cards deep. Oath of Nissa is kind of like the OG of just, being played because it has a lot of utility in finding the cards that you need/want in this deck, and then also offering a green devotion. And it's not really that bad in multiples. In a world now where we have stuff like Invasion of Ixalan, where you can play multiples of them and, keep that kind of green devotion, where having redundant copies of Oath of Nissa doesn't add any more green devotion to your, it essentially doesn't add any more green devotion, but it does do something when it enters. So when it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 3 cards of your library, you reveal a creature, land, or planeswalker from among them, put it to your hand, put the rest on the bottom in a random order. And this says you may spend mana as over mana of any color to cast planeswalker spells. This was a little bit more important back in the day when they played Nicobolas the Dragon God and whatnot, and some other planeswalker nonsense, because you could just make a ton of green mana and spend that mana as mana of any color to cast planeswalkers, which is pretty neat. But this is a cheaper way. You only get to dig 3 cards for 1 mana, but still kind of the same idea. It's going to sit on the battlefield, it's going to give you green devotion, and it's going to find you either the creatures or potentially lands and stuff in your deck that you're going to want to look for and dig deeper for Nykthoses, dig deeper for Cavalier Thorns. I can also dig for Nykthoses and whatnot. Just kind of a crazy sequence of how things can kind of snowball from there, because you have quite a few ways of doing that. And one of the ways that you can absolutely bury your opponents, and one of the best ways to kind of accrue that advantage and kind of keep your combo going, is Storm the Festival. So for 3 generic and 3 green, for sorcery, you look at the top 5 cards of the library. You may put up to 2 permanent cards with mana value 5 or less from among them onto the battlefield. Put the rest on your bottom of the library in random order. It also has flashback for 10 total mana, 7 generic, and 3 green. So essentially what Storm the Festival is saying, it's not saying that you can pick 2 cards that together have total mana value 5 or less and put them on the battlefield. It means like each individual card can cost 5 or less. So essentially your entire deck. So you could put 2 Cavalier Thorns into play. You could put an Umwald Oddity and a Cavalier Thorns into play, whatnot. Doesn't matter, obviously, if you put more mana into play than you spent on the Storm the Festival, it's going to end up being a good thing. The only exception being that you find like Nykthos and you're able to keep chaining things together. It's very common for this deck to cast a Storm the Festival and then just be able to then flash it back as like their next spell, because they more than likely found another Nykthos, so they found like Cavalier and like an Old Growth Troll, and then they were able to, you know, flip into another Nykthos. They had mana left over, so they were able to activate it again. They added 6 green Devotion, whatnot. They're more than likely to activate it again. Or even Kiora plus Cavalier Thorns, or Trailblazer plus Kiora, whatnot. Just any combination of these things can snowball out of control and get you to the point where you're getting another Nykthos activation to flashback Storm the Festival. Which, if you haven't found out already, Nykthos is super important to this deck. You have the mana base here. You have like 2 Besejus. This is kind of stock, I would say, for a lot of green decks, whether you play like Modern or Pioneer, where you're playing at least 1 copy of Beseju, but 2 seems to be kind of the comfortable spot for a lot of people. 12 Forest, 3 Lair of the Hydra. This is like a mana sink that you can just put all of the rest of your mana into. It can also make a really big creature for when you flip Ulvenwald Oddity, having, you know, +1/+1 trample haste. You know, like whatever, you're putting like 20 mana into this, and you have a 21/21 trample haste creature. So that even if this is like the turn you play, you can untap with Kiora, and again, just sink your mana into it, attack your opponent, you know, say goodnight. Pick Your Poison has been a popular sideboard card in just about every format that it's legal in, and I'm not surprised in Pioneer. It's a good way to get rid of the annoying vampires that are flying around, mainly like the Vein Rippers and whatnot, without triggering their ward cost, which in this deck I think isn't necessarily the end of the world. Plus, you can kind of beat it in combat with multiple Cavalier Thorns. The Stonebrain, what we talked about earlier, like this was kind of a combo piece with Karn the Great Creator when it was a part of the deck. The Stonebrain still does a very good job of just naming cards out of your opponent's deck that are just very annoying or very hard for your deck to deal with. You know, you could name something like Vein Ripper from like the Vampires deck, and you're just going to go way bigger than what they have going on. You bring this in against like Amalia, you can just name something, you know, Amalia, the namesake card, or Wild Growth Walker or whatnot. You can just kind of neuter their game plan altogether. I don't think you'd actually bring this in against vampires, but that's just kind of like the example. You know, if you feel the need to bring this in, as long as you have a lot of like format knowledge, for one, you probably won't bring it in certain matchups, but in other ones too, like this just can kind of hose decks and just leave them without really a good way of winning the game, and kind of resort to a plan B or a plan C while you're still able to do the devotion thing and absolutely bury your opponent in big creatures. Unlicensed Search has been a very good card about just getting cards out of the graveyard, messing with those graveyard decks. Also, the fact that it's going to get bigger, and again, like when you transform this Ulvenwald Oddity and you're able to crew this Unlicensed Hearse, and it has like 8-10 cards underneath of it, is going to hit so hard on your opponent. 2 Obstinate Baloth. I believe Liliana of the Veil is seeing kind of an uptick in play, so this is kind of like good value against her. But I think more than anything, it's a 4-mana 4/4. It's a big body, gives you 2 green Devotion pips, and it gains 4 life when it comes into play, and it's going to block a lot of, you know, other creatures and stuff nicely, and kind of stop those aggressive decks. 4 Sky Sovereign seems very excessive, but I know from some people on Twitter that Sky Sovereign has been absolutely nuts, namely like Cedric Phillips just absolutely crushing with this deck, and, you know, Sky Sovereign essentially being an MVP for him. Cityscape Leveler. Sometimes you see this card in the main. I think a lot of the times you see on the sideboard along with like Emrakul the Promised End. Cityscape Leveler, whenever you cast a spell or it attacks, you disrupt one target non-land permanent and its owner's controller, or its controller creates a tap Power Stone token, which essentially means that the Power Stone token can only cast can't cast non-artifact spells. I believe you can use the mana to activate things, but most decks aren't playing like artifacts and whatnot, so they're not really going to be able to use the Power Stone. So you're just going to be able to blow up their important non-land permanents, and they're not really going to be able to do anything about it. It also has Unearth for 8, so if your opponent doesn't manage to get rid of it, you can just bring it back, hit them for 8, blow up one of their other, again, important non-land permanents, and continue to put them on the back foot. And probably just annoy them to no end, because Cityscape Leveler is such an annoying card to have played against you, and that means that you have to be playing it against your opponents. Emrakul the Promised End costs 1 less to cast for each card type among cards in your graveyard. You could have a decent amount of them in your graveyard. And then when you cast Emrakul, you gain control of target opponents during their next turn, and then after that turn, that player takes an extra turn, which doesn't really matter because turns out you can do a lot of damage when you take your opponent's turn. It also has flying, trample, protection from instants and sorceries, not sorceries, protection from instants, and it's a 13/13. It is going to end the game very quickly. So in general, that's kind of like the card by card of this, and I did take a lot of time because I did kind of explain some things. So this deck I would kind of classify in that combo-ish strategy, and that's thanks to Outcaster Trailblazer just being essentially redundant copies of Kiora. Kiora was really good, even though you can only have one on the battlefield, for the fact that your creatures were going to replace themselves. Now, thanks to Outcaster Trailblazer, you have a way to have multiple copies of this kind of draw effect on the battlefield at the same time, where Cavalier Thorns getting to draw 2 cards and then also ramp you as well, and dig even deeper for Nykthoses, which again are going to help you continue to kind of combo, because you can just play a Cavalier, you end up milling a Festival, you find a Nykthos, you get to put the Nykthos into play, keep the untapped one, add a ton of mana, flashback Storm the Festival, you find another Cavalier, you find Outcaster Trailblazers, you get to generate mana, you get to kind of spin the wheel again for a Nykthos, or even if you find another Nykthos, all the Storm the Festival, and you find like an Old Growth Troll, again, Outcaster Trailblazer, even an Ulvenwald Oddity, you're going to kind of be able to keep spinning the wheel here and getting to draw cards where even if, you only put, another 12 Devotion into play, your Nykthos is going to tap for 15, 20 mana on the next turn if your opponent doesn't have something like a Supreme Verdict. And again, you've drawn so many cards, you've looked at so many cards, that it's very unlikely that you don't have like another Storm the Festival kind of waiting in the wings, whether in the graveyard or in your hand, or that you drew any one of these other big creatures that you're going to be able to play and, again, trigger Trailblazers, trigger Kioras, and continue to draw cards and keep them flowing until you can find the Ulvenwald Oddity and flip it. And that's kind of where this deck differs now than it did even a year ago, back in 2023, where you were playing a lot of these big creatures, but you really weren't playing Ulvenwald Oddity, you were playing just other creatures that had a lot of green devotion symbols, and Karn just allowed you to play this kind of not really difficult sideboard. I mean, you really didn't get the sideboard with mono green, where in these versions now you have to kind of sideboard. But in general, now it definitely leans into more of the big green creature, a lot of devotion game plan. And instead of your combo finish being Stonebraining your opponent to death, you just find a new Oddity, flip it, give your creatures trample and haste, because you can do it all in the same turn then, and then attacking your opponent for lethal damage. And in a lot of cases, basically like that's the way that you can beat Amalia, because in like the way the deck was built before, just even a year ago, heck, even just 6 months ago, or I guess really around the time Karn was banned, which was like beginning of December, so I guess like 7-8 months ago. You could put a bunch of creatures into play if you maybe couldn't find Karn or really couldn't go for it or whatever the case may be. You just put a bunch of creatures into play, pass the turn, and your opponent could just wipe the board, get rid of all your devotion. Sure, maybe you have a few Cavalier Thorns like triggers where you can put some cards that are in your graveyard on top of your library to try and rebuild. But by and large, like if that happened, the game was over. And in this case here, you're able to do that. You're able to put a ton of power into play. You're ton of creatures, what have you, and then win the game immediately by flipping this Ulvenwald Oddity. This card is so insane for this deck. The fact that it just adds so much power by itself, and then on top of that too, can add even more power with its kind of Lord effect, and then giving those creatures haste is absolutely insane for this deck. Storm the Festival individually is probably your best card that is not named Nykthos for how much value that it can generate. The fact that it's for 6 mana, you could put potentially up to 10 mana worth of things into play. And really that's just 2 Cavalier Thorns. But again, if you have Outcast or Trailblazer, you have Kioras into play, just having multiples of these is absolutely nuts. Or even finding like a second Outcast or Trailblazer and a Cavalier, you're going to draw 2 cards and then look 5 cards deep for another Nykthos to kind of keep going. Or potentially even milling like a Storm the Festival if you already have a ton of mana to be able to flash it back and potentially kind of keep the chain going to, again, find this Ulvenwald Oddity. Crazy how everything always comes back to the Oddity because it is just so powerful and so good for this deck. Really, the idea and kind of some ideal hands that you're looking for when like you're playing this deck, Leyline of the Guild Pact is sort of kind of in a way a mulligan for the deck. Because even though it's going to be in your hand and it's going to go on the battlefield, it's going to be 4 green Devotion, it doesn't really do anything for the deck. I'm sure there's probably some sideboard cards or some other cards that care about like your creatures or things being a certain color and whatnot, or maybe like land types. But for like this deck in particular, it's not going to benefit from it. It's only really going to potentially benefit your opponent, I guess, in a way. But this just giving you 4 green Devotion is the only reason why this is in the deck. And obviously it's very good on that front, but you're not going to get any more value from it. So you kind of remember that if this is in your opening hand, even though there's going to be a lot of green Devotion, it's going to put you on a mulligan to 6. So your hand has to be pretty good kind of like past this as far as stuff to do. If you're looking at maybe Forest Nykthos and then maybe 1 or 2 Elvish Mystics or Llanowar Elves, what have you, some combination of those, and then like an Old Growth Troll, you're going to be able to have a ton of mana in play, and you're essentially looking for stuff like Storm the Festival, Invasion of Ixalan to find some of these other big creatures like Cavalier Thorns, Ulvenwald Oddity, Outcast Trailblazer, even finding like Kioras to generate more mana and then still get you a creature, still get you a permanent that is going to care about big creatures entering and allowing you to draw cards and just absolutely, again, take over the game and just keep pressure on your opponent because you're putting so many big things into play, so many impactful permanents into play, and also getting to kind of keep up with them on cards. When you get to cast 10 spells in a turn and the turn with like 7 cards in hand, and your opponent plays 1 spell and they have a lot less cards than you, that's pretty good, turns out. I would definitely say that is a uncontroversial take to have. But yeah, like this Mono Green Devotion deck is pretty straightforward, but can be pretty complicated. A lot of it is going to be kind of sequencing. You're not caring for the most part what your opponent is doing. You're just kind of trying to do your thing. So like if I was playing against like the Nykthos ramp deck, I would definitely focus on hitting the Devotion things where you can. You kind of have to get lucky and hope they don't have a Nykthos, because they just have a lot of these permanents where you don't want to kill them or they just kind of sit on the battlefield. You're going to be in a little bit of trouble just because that's going to be free Devotion, and everything past that is going to be gravy. But, definitely focus on killing the elves and stuff like that early on so that they don't get the additional mana from them getting to tap for mana, but then also using them for their green Devotion to end up powering out things like Cavalier Thorns and whatnot later in the game, or even like Storm the Festivals and whatnot. You definitely want to kind of mitigate that. This isn't necessarily a deck, too, where I like bringing in Graveyard Hate or even, effects like Stone Brain and whatnot. Even though, like, maybe it could be good. I know that there's some debate on bringing it in the, like, mirror matches for naming Nykthos and whatnot. Honestly, you do what you feel is right, kind of in that case. The Stone Brain is kind of like the surgical back in the day of Magic, where players were like, you bring surgical in every matchup because it always has a target. Stone Brain technically always has a target, and you can always name a card that's going to be pretty impactful for your opponent, but obviously do not bring it in every matchup. That's just complete nonsense. Which I'm probably speaking right now because I'm on like 0 sleep. But yeah, the Nykthos strategy ends up being pretty straightforward. As like the person playing it, if you understand kind of like your sequencing and whatnot, understanding that when you play Elvish Mystic and Llanowar Elves, when you have a Nykthos in play, these are essentially mana neutral because you're going to pay a green mana to put it on the battlefield. It's going to give you a green devotion, which is then kind of going to come back from the Nykthos anyway. Same thing with like Old Growth Troll and whatnot, really specifically those cards, and I guess Oath of Nissa as well, because they are going to generate the same amount of mana. Like you're going to essentially get it back, and your Nykthos is going to be more valuable because if you play something like a Kiora, then you're going to be able to untap it with all the devotion that you just added to the battlefield, and then double up on it again with Kiora. And of course, Cavaliers finding more Nykthoses can generate even more mana and just more card advantage and stuff thanks to Kiora and Outcaster Trailblazer. As you can tell, is because that's like the super important engine of the deck. If you're the person that's like playing against this deck, you definitely want to prioritize controlling what green mana symbols stay on the battlefield, and then just putting pressure on them, because this deck can stumble. It does have a fail rate. It does mulligan decently well, I would say. You definitely don't want to be going 4 to 5 with any deck, but with this deck, if you have a like a Forest Nykthos, an Elf, and maybe like an Invasion or like an Oath of Nissa, and maybe a big creature, that's a really good 5-card hand. Even like a Kiora as well. That's a really good 5-card hand to have, especially if your opponents can't interact with you. And if you're the person that is kind of interacting with the mono green deck, then you have to be able to disrupt them and put a lot of pressure on them early. That's why, like, in a way, I wouldn't say that the Izzet Phoenix deck is necessarily a dog in a matchup like this, or even the Rakdos deck, because we know that they are capable of putting a ton of pressure into play. Just with them, if they draw like the wrong half of their deck, where they draw kind of creature heavy, or in the case of Izzet Phoenix, they draw very cantrip heavy, you're going to kind of get run over by like the average green draw. So, but yeah, that is the Nykthos ramp deck for Pioneer. I think I've rambled long enough about this deck. Again, pretty straightforward game plan. As long as you kind of get the sequencing down, you kind of get a good idea of what the deck is supposed to do. And it feels like kind of the Tron of the Pioneer format in the sense that, you want to focus on producing as much mana as possible on every turn and making the most impactful plays. You have tons of haymakers. While Tron, I guess in Modern, you were playing essentially one haymaker every turn. This deck, you can just chain your haymakers together into just one super punch that is just going to knock your opponent's sleeves right off of their cards with how hard that this deck can hit early and often. So, yeah, that's going to be me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below what deck you want to see next in one of these Beginner's Guides series. I don't think that... I mean, I've probably talked more about Nykthos Ramp in this video than I have really probably any other deck in these Beginner series, but it is a deck that rewards you for playing smart, for sequencing correctly, doing things in the right order, drawing cards when you should draw cards, and then, using ETBs when you should in between them and whatnot, if the situation actually comes up. But, yep, that's going to do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it. Again, subscribe if you have not already done so. I appreciate you all for the support, and, it's been a heck of a ride, and we're going to be looking to continue it on. So, that's going to do it for me. Hope you all enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you all in the next one.